When we first touched on this, I think most of you would be thinking, is this a story with the smallest violin ever? A risk that millionaires might leave the United Kingdom. Should I really be worried about that? But yes, actually, you should.
Because, well, should we first, let's just define what a millionaire is. You're the economist here. When we refer to a millionaire exodus, or I've seen some paperwork referring to dollar millionaires, what's the definition of a millionaire? Is it wealth in the bank? Is it assets?
Yeah, so a millionaire, actually, the bar it's still wealthy, but the bar is much lower than you would imagine. Many, many more people are millionaires in the UK. It's about 4.5% of the whole population. And it is about assets, which can include property as well as shareholdings. It includes your pension as well as your income and any actual cash you have. And we talk about millionaires as dollar millionaires so that you can compare between countries. So a dollar millionaire in the UK is actually someone whose wealth, including all those things, is £760,000 because that's the equivalent in sterling. So actually, although it sounds a lot in a headline, it's actually people who are towards the top of the income scale and towards the top of the asset scale, but it's many, many more people than you might imagine. The top 1% of people in the UK in terms of assets and income pay nearly 30% of all income tax. So what is happening is that worries about what might Labour do with wealth taxes of various descriptions, many of which they put into their manifesto, which we're going to get to in a minute. What does that mean for people living here? And does that mean that people will leave? And the Adam Smith Institute has done a report today saying that there is this exodus problem.
Although, I'm going to caveat this slightly by saying that even before Labour came into power, there were different reports forecasting that millionaires would be leaving the UK. So I did a little bit of research. Two different reports. And actually there were some in Britain railing against them because it kind of painted a too negative picture of Britain, this idea that more millionaires would be leaving here than, for instance, other countries associated with millionaires like the US, Germany, China, Japan. So the US Global Wealth Report for this year predicted that the number of millionaires would plunge by 17% between 2023 and 2028.
In America or in...
No, in the UK.
In the UK.
So it was a US report, but it was regarding the UK. Another report, the Private Wealth Migration Report, said that during 2024, Britain would lose a net 9,500 millionaires. So that was meant to be more than any other country bar China. Having said all that, this is an intriguing stat, which I think kind of contradicts that narrative. In 2022, there were 83,800 non-doms in this country. That's non-domiciled people. And these are the people that are associated with the term millionaire because they have some of their wealth, they have their life based in the UK, but not necessarily their wealth. Is that the right definition?
Well, it's that they are taxed in a foreign country, which is not here.
Taxed in a foreign country. But actually that number, despite all of the threats to removing non-dom status and changing the rules around non-doms, don't seem to have put people off because last year, 12,900 new people assumed non-dom status in the UK. So what I'm saying is this millionaire exodus has been predicted for quite some time. And there are some, particularly on the right, Ross Clark wrote a really interesting piece for The Spectator, questioning the figures, saying there's a difference between talking about a millionaire exodus, that could be some boomer who's retired, that could be, frankly, anyone living in the southeast who's paid off their mortgage, compared to whether there is an entrepreneur exodus. And that's a bit more worrying because then you are actually talking about wealth creators. There's a massive gulf, isn't there, between, for instance, my father, who owns his semi-detached Victorian house in St Albans and would therefore automatically be classed as a millionaire, but is no longer working, with a 25-year-old who's leaving to go to Silicon Valley because he thinks that his IT company will flourish more in California than it will in Shoreditch, right?
Yeah, and the issue is how much of those assets are available to you. So it's about cash and ability. Yes, your father may be, in asset terms, a millionaire, but unless he sells his house, he's not going to be able to move. He's not a cash millionaire. So you're right. It's the amount of free cash available that adds to whether you can move. On the non-doms issue, the fact is that the previous Conservative government ensured that actually there were what Labour might describe as loopholes, but that non-doms could still have tax relationships abroad and still be here. And as you're seeing in the numbers, that means that non-doms have actually come here because it is still tax neutral for them. The effects will happen if Labour do what they say they were going to do in the manifesto, which is to close these loopholes that Jeremy Hunt, the previous Chancellor, made sure were there, which actually makes the point that you're making, that non-doms actually didn't flee because Hunt made sure that they still were able to have their tax affairs in a way that was neutral for them and therefore didn't need to leave. Now,
yes, you've
got the manifesto
I
here.
love this.
So
You're
let's
a
go
man
through. So
who has sources, has data.
I have this, of course, by my bed. I read it every night.
Yes.
God, hasn't life changed since that? The proud,
Let me see that power stance.
Keir Starmer, change.
Change.
I'll just read out what they actually said, the Labour Party, before in opposition before the election. And again, it goes back to this problem that Labour has. There is such a difference between what you say in opposition when you're campaigning and what you can do in government. So this is what they said. Labour will address unfairness in the tax system. So there's the first thing you've said, which is a campaigning message. This must be unfair. This is not about ensuring that wealthy people stay here and pay taxes, which of course pay for schools, the health service, etc., etc. You immediately place it as being unfair. What you're going to do. We will abolish non-dom status once and for all, replacing it with a modern scheme for people genuinely in the country for a short period. We will end the use of offshore trusts to avoid inheritance tax so that everyone who makes their home here in the UK pays their taxes here. Private equity is the only industry where performance-related pay is treated as capital gains. Labour will close this loophole. So, Rachel Reeves goes into the Treasury as the new Chancellor, waving the manifesto, saying, "I've got these plans on non-doms. That's going to create £1 billion of more tax revenue for the Exchequer on this private equity change of the way that their bonuses are paid. That will bring in £560 million." Treasury civil servants sit there, go, "Yes, very, very good, Chancellor. Love your new plans," and they say, I just want to explain to you the effects of what we describe as dynamic effects. So what happens is, yes, you start changing the taxes, but of course those people, many of whom do have access to lots of cash, simply move. So the analysis that is being actually, I think, deliberately leaked out to the papers, that they could now resile on the non-doms tax status and actually keep some of the loopholes that Jeremy Hunt put in place deliberately to stop non-doms leaving the UK, and they look like they're going to change the way they look at private equity bonus payments called carried interest and not actually tax it at the same level as income tax, because what actually happens at the moment, private equity bonuses under the carried interest system, they pay 28% tax as if it's a capital gains. Labour wants to put that onto an income tax, yes, 45% level. But if private equity workers leave to go and live in Switzerland or wherever it might be, which is much more tax advantageous, Dubai, for example, which they can do, you don't only not get the 45% income tax, you don't get the 28% either. So not only are you not raising the £560 million of tax Labour claimed they would raise, which they said they would pay out for mental health workers' use to have many more mental health workers available to people, but you actually lose money because you're not getting the 28% either. And the analysis is the Treasury, I believe, and this is what has been reported, has said you could actually lose £300 million. So your big trumpeted tax change on fairness will actually lose you money. And it could be similar for non-doms. And this is always the trap of dynamic effects, because you are dealing with a population that are highly mobile, that can work anywhere. Their job is not making something. Their job is financial transactions and running companies, which can be run from any, city around the world. And therefore, you don't get the tax income from them. And this is what the Adam Smith Institute is saying is a problem, because, of course, we have a very weighted tax system in the UK, which means that the upper earners pay far more in tax in gross terms than lower earners. Although, of course, lower earners, to be super, super clear, lower earners pay a higher proportion of their income in tax.
What's interesting as well is that we have got away with that approach because it's felt as if the UK is an advantageous place to live. So we often have a case, don't we, where high net worth individuals may base their businesses abroad but seem to keep their families here. And why do they do that? Because they love the British culture, they like the rule of law, they find it easier here to access private healthcare, and indeed, despite the VAT decision on fees, to educate their children in good private schools. And by the way, they want their children to go to good UK universities. I get the competition from the Ivy League in the US, but that's the attraction of London. There was an interesting report in January by the London School of Economics, and they asked 35 top 1%ers whether they felt the need, with the prospect at that point of a Labour government coming in and putting taxes up, to leave the country and go to so-called tax havens. Well, it's interesting when people are given a choice. Some of the quotes from this report I found really interesting. For instance, one multi-millionaire saying, "What puts me off is that I have a nice life here in London. My clients who move to the Bahamas are bored to death." Another said that they would only consider moving if we return to a kind of 1970s days of super tax. Michael Caine leaves and goes and lives in America because he's literally only able to keep 10% of his wealth under that Labour government at the time. So on one hand, we have this attractive culture that keeps millionaires and their families here. However, and you know more about this than me, but I thought this was interesting, the environment in London now to actually raise capital as a business owner, the idea that people who are trying to raise capital and investment here are finding it more adverse, the conditions more difficult. Perhaps that's due to over-regulation, but this is an interesting stat. There's also a problem, isn't there, with IT and the facilities to accommodate IT growth not perhaps matching some of our American counterparts. Also, the so-called decline of the FTSE has put some people off from investing in here. But this is interesting. What's an IPO, Kamal?
An initial public offering.
Right. So initial public offering, that would be like a fledgling business wanting to...
No, it could be quite a big business. So it's a business that wants shareholders, and so they put themselves on the market so that shareholders can buy shares in a business that was previously private.
Okay. So the number of IPOs in the UK has gone down dramatically. In 2023, there were just 14 compared to 132 in America. And I remember making that point during Brexit. The competition won't necessarily be between the City of London and Paris, Milan and Frankfurt. It will always be between the City of London and America. Do you think that's a fair analysis?
I think you've raised a huge number of things there, which all could be podcasts in their own right.
Indeed.
And some people would say that, we need to at least rethink our relationship in banking and capital markets terms with the European Union now that we've left. There obviously has been a reforecasting of how those markets will work. Now we're outside of the EU. But that's a whole different debate. I think, remember back to when Labour last won an election in 1997, and Peter Mandelson famously saying, Labour is super relaxed with people being filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes. Now that tone to many rich people is not as off-putting as we're going to deal with unfairness and you're the target. And I think this Labour government is much more traditional in its approach to the idea of wealth, i.e. that wealth in some way is a bad thing and somehow we need to make that clear to working people that there are certain types of working people who aren't as good and don't and should be doing more. But it comes up against this hard rock of the market will just simply change under your feet. And I think what the Treasury team, what Rachel Reeves' Treasury team in opposition have found coming into power is that the Treasury officials are warning them that the Office for Budget Responsibility, which marks the Treasury's homework, will not give you all the money you think you could have raised via these taxes because of the way the market will change. And that is what the Adam Smith Institute is pointing out.
In terms of wealth taxes, I mean, my general sort of right-wing free market capitalist approach is, could we please have the wealthiest people making the most money for themselves, but also employing people who then have meaningful work to put food on the table for their families? And can everyone just pay the requisite amount of tax? You know, I'm all for that Laffer curve. You know, maybe there is a very strong argument. We saw it with corporation tax going down in countries like Ireland, and lo and behold, receipts go up because companies think, oh, I tell you what, I might go and set my company up in Dublin if I'm paying 6% less than I am in the UK or whatever that figure is. If you are earning over a certain bracket, 200, 300 grand, and you're paying 45% tax, is that unfair when you're considering that somebody's on 2 or 3 million paying the same amount? I mean, I'm just happy for as many people who are earning as much as possible to pay their tax fairly. What strikes me as slightly the politics of envy that's almost been reflected, we discussed it yesterday, in the sort of Bridget Phillipson, if you send your children to private school, then you are far too successful for our liking, is this idea that anybody with any wealth is somehow on the take or not paying their taxes or trying to, I get the whole tax avoidance thing, but are evading their taxes in some way.
Or don't deserve, they sort of, I think wealth is used as a negative, that somehow wealth is not deserved. If people are wealthy, they're not working.
Yes, greed is good or
and
something.
And also, of course, for many people, wealthy is not that high a bar.
Yes.
Lots of people earn, very modest incomes. And so when you say someone earns £100,000 or £150,000, you think, well, that's wealthy. Of course they can pay more tax. But what Peter Mandelson got right, the signal you send to people who are wealthy, if it is negative, they will leave, and that will create the effects because they pay a huge proportion of our income tax. That's one of our biggest taxes that pays for hospitals and education. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that non-DOMs pay £6 billion in UK taxes every year. That's about a tenth of the whole school's budget for England.
Handy to have that money.
That money is important, and I think Labour needs to be careful on the signals it sends. Let's look at Italy. Giorgia Meloni has introduced a flat tax regime, a partial flat tax regime. If you are wealthy, you can agree, whatever your income, to pay €200,000 of tax a year. That sounds like a huge amount, £170,000 in tax every year. But what's happened for people who in other countries would pay far more income tax because of their high levels of wealth are moving to Italy to run their businesses or to live themselves. And it's been credited with bringing 2,700 multi-millionaires into Italy and actually increasing their tax take. So I can feel the awkwardness of the left in these debates because it is difficult. If you're on the left of the political spectrum, wealth is a thing which you feel is negative, and somehow hard-working people almost shouldn't be wealthy. I dislike the argument, but I know that lots of people on the left feel uncomfortable with people being rich. But the problem is that if you then push yourselves in that direction, and you've got the unions. Remember when we had Sharon Graham at the Labour Party conference, and she was very passionately calling for a wealth tax. That really gets Labour going.
Yes.
But it doesn't work fiscally. And Rachel Reeves is again finding out the huge difference between life in opposition, where you can say what motivates your base, and life in government.
Also, just optically, it's poor. Just to give you a little anecdote, a friend of mine drives a Porsche, And he went down to get the Porsche service at this little village place that just specialises in Porsches. And he was saying to me how the owner had said that they had lost 25 customers since Labour took power because people are feeling really negative. We've seen this reflected in the Consumer Confidence Index, right? This idea that, oh my God, I'm really worried, I don't want to spend my money because what's the budget going to do to my finances? That doesn't create the best atmosphere inside Britain, but from the outside world looking in, this idea that millionaires are running for the hills, as you say, Rishi Sunak is about to reinvigorate his green card, it doesn't look great.
It's important that you have the right positive entrepreneurial tone to what kind of country you want to run. In 1997, it was very, very clear that this was a country where people could make money. 2024, it is not clear that Keir Starmer backs wealth creators, because with it does come, sometimes for people on the left, you hold your nose because these people pay the bills.
Maybe you should take some advice from Lord Ali on this. I mean, he's got a few bob, hasn't he?